Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News broadcasting live from Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Vladimir Putin proposes a high-tech duel between Russia and American missiles as he predicts dramatic changes in the war against Ukraine. Meanwhile, North Korea's Kim Jong-un is reportedly training and deploying fresh troops to support Russia on the battlefield. And Gisele Pelicot is jailed for 20 years for drugging and sexually assaulting his wife and inviting others to join in. Gisele Pelicot thanks supporters outside court as a historic mass rape trial comes to an end. To our top story, and Russia's President Vladimir Putin has proposed a high-tech duel with the US in Kyiv during his annual address in Moscow. Referencing the US missiles provided by the country, Putin predicted dramatic changes in the war. He also told the end-of-year conference that he's planning to talk with his former ally and ousted Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad, as well as US President-elect Donald Trump. Let's speak to our correspondent now in Moscow, Dasha Chernyshova. Thank you so much for joining us, Dasha. Dasha, Putin predicted dramatic changes in the war with Ukraine. What did he mean by this, and what changes could he actually be referencing to?
Well, indeed, the Russian president has been asked many questions on the ongoing special military operation in Ukraine, as Moscow insists we call it. And in those answers that he has been provided to the Russian public, as well as the journalists, he said Russia has had the upper hand in the area of this operation. He has said that Russian troops have been taking territory by square kilometers, not just by meters. And he insisted that the Russian military-industrial complex has been meeting the demands from the Russian military. Also, the Russian president has said that there are no preconditions for any talks when it comes to the negotiated settlement in Ukraine. However, he has stressed that the agreements that have been reached by Russia and the Ukrainian delegation in spring of 2022 in Istanbul should be taken as the basis for any negotiated settlement. He also has stressed that there are realities on the ground that are changing rapidly, with Russia again taking more control of more territories, and those realities will also have to be taken into account. So the Russian president has said that Moscow is ready to compromise, it is ready for talks. But again, he stressed that the Russian national interest, that the Russian concerns have to be addressed as well. So certainly the Russian president has once again reiterated the position we have heard repeatedly from Moscow. But obviously, with the flow of information and news lines coming about the possibility of ceasefire, those questions have persisted.
Putin says he plans to meet with Bashar al-Assad, a former ally turned refugee in his country. Could we see Putin potentially use Assad as a bargaining chip?
Well, it is very difficult to see how Moscow will be building its ties now with the former president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, after he has been granted asylum in Russia and had been flown to Moscow from the military base in Syria, mainly airfields that Russia has in that country. So we know from President Vladimir Putin that Moscow at the moment maintains dialogue and contacts with all of the forces that are in Syria. He has stressed that Moscow is willing to continue that dialogue. Moscow had offered to use its military bases in Syria for humanitarian purposes and the delivery of humanitarian aid as well. He has said, however, that Moscow will think about retaining those bases, saying that in this case, if those bases remain in Syria, there has to be the coincidence of the interests of Russia and the new Syrian authorities. All that is the subject of further negotiations. And speaking about Assad, Vladimir Putin had said that Russia had been fighting against terrorism in Syria. So it is just proving once again that what Moscow was willing to see is the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the Syrian Republic. Also, he has said that he had not met with Assad before, but he could be seen and sitting down with him in the Russian, on the Russian territory or somewhere else, because Moscow had not confirmed that Assad is actually in the Russian capital, although the letter that has been recently released by Assad was dated to be from Moscow.
We also heard him speak about talks with Donald Trump. Let's take a listen now.
What can I offer to the President-elect Trump when we meet? First of all, I don't know when we will meet because he doesn't say anything about it. I haven't spoken to him for more than 4 years, and I am ready for it. Of course, at any time, and I will be ready for a meeting if he wants it. You and the people who pay your wages in the U.S. would be very much like Russia to be in a weakened position. I have a different point of view. I believe that Russia has become much stronger over the past 2 or 3 years. Why? Because we are becoming a truly sovereign country. We are no longer dependent on anyone.
So that was Putin there speaking about Trump. But let's just focus on President Biden. He's gone to great lengths to supply Ukraine with enough military aid until the end of his term in office. But what will be on the agenda when he speaks to Trump?
Well, we understand that for the Russian president, it is paramount to make sure that the sovereignty of Russia is ensured. And that has always been the position of the Russian officials. That's when the operation began, and even before the start of this operation, there have been concerns in Moscow about NATO encroachment, about the Ukrainian territory being turned into what Moscow has often referred to as anti-Russia. So in this possible meeting, it is very likely that the Russian president will be talking about those concerns and the need to alleviate those. And all that falls into the wider discussion about the architecture of security for Asia and Europe. So all those issues are paramount for Moscow and are likely to be raised in this possible discussion.
Dasha, Chernyshova in Moscow, thank you so much for joining us. Now, South Korea believes its North leader Kim Jong-un is training new troops intended to fight for Russia. It comes after at least 100 North Koreans deployed to support Moscow's war efforts in Ukraine's Kursk region have been killed and thousands more injured. It's believed that Pyongyang has deployed more than 10,000 of their own troops to support Russia over the course of the war, as well as shipping containers of artillery rounds, rockets and rocket launchers. For more on this, I'm joined by the former British ambassador to North Korea, John Everard. John, thank you so much for joining us this evening. First of all, lawmakers in South Korea say the North soldiers have suffered heavy losses in Ukraine. What is your read on this?
In Russia rather than Ukraine, they're attacking the Ukrainian positions in Russia's Kursk region. It's very difficult to verify these figures, but on the other hand, there's no real reason to doubt them. We are looking at untrained and inexperienced soldiers in an unfamiliar environment. Great rumours circulating that they have particular difficulty confronting drones. They never really had to work with drones before. Also, rumours that the Russians use them effectively as cannon fodder. They make the North Koreans walk towards Ukrainian positions so that the Ukrainians are forced to open fire, thus revealing where they are, so that the Russians themselves can return fire. It's inevitable, if that is indeed what the Russians are doing, that casualties amongst the North Koreans are going to be extremely high. And if the initial figure of a deployment of 10,000 troops is correct, and the South Korean lawmakers are right, that around 1,000 have already been taken out of action with wounds of various kinds, 10% casualties over a couple of months is a very high rate.
Experts suggest North Korea's weapons are outdated. Troops, as you say, are inexperienced. Is Putin becoming desperate?
Well, yes. I think anybody who has to rely on North Korean munitions, which are of appallingly low quality, and on North Korean troops, which, as we were saying, are inexperienced and where there have been several incidents of the North Koreans shooting Russian soldiers because they can't distinguish them from Ukrainians. That is an act of desperation. It also exposes great vulnerability, because if that supply of munitions and troops was ever cut off and North Korea isn't really very stable, then the Russian war effort in Ukraine would be very severely hampered.
And I just want to talk about Trump. He's entering the White House soon. He famously met Kim Jong-un. Is he the man to coordinate the end of this conflict, do you think?
We really don't know, do we? I mean, everybody remembers that not that long ago, Donald Trump was talking about ending the Ukraine war in a day. And people thought that he meant by that he simply forced President Zelensky to run up a white flag. But since then, we've had that extraordinary telephone conversation between President-elect Trump and President Putin just a few weeks ago, where, according to the Washington Post, Trump said, firstly, Putin was not to escalate. He seems to have issued almost an instruction to President Putin not to take the war to any kind of higher level. Also, he seems to have warned Putin that the United States maintains numerous troops in Europe, which was clearly a veiled threat. Now, the Kremlin was so upset by this conversation that it tried to pretend it never existed. This clearly wasn't what Vladimir Putin wanted to hear. But in the light of this conversation, I think we have to reassess what President Trump might do when in office. It's quite possible that he will lean quite heavily on President Putin, as well as urging President Zelensky, to reach some kind of agreement. Further point here, what's happened in Syria affects profoundly what happens in Ukraine for all kinds of reasons, but amongst others, that Russia looks weak, and President Trump famously despises losers. It's probable that President Putin's stock in President Trump's estimation has gone sharply down over the last fortnight.
John, North Korea and Russia signed a defence pact back in June, which includes a form of mutual defence. Does this mean NATO could be at war with North Korea also if an open conflict did break out between NATO and Russia?
It's a theoretical possibility. You would need to reach a situation which triggers the all for one and one for all clause in the NATO treaty, so that NATO as a bloc would be at war with Russia, and you would then have to have conflict with actual North Korean troops on the ground. So a few steps to go through before you got to that situation. But yes, it's not impossible.
John Everard, the former British ambassador to North Korea, thank you for your insights. Gisele Pelicot, the man responsible for drugging and sexually assaulting his wife and inviting others to rape her while she was unconscious, has been jailed for 20 years today, the maximum time available for aggravated rape in France. The 72-year-old had confessed to all the charges against Gisele Pelicot and was sentenced alongside 51 other men in Paris today. In total, the men responsible were jailed for more than 400 years. Outside court, Ms. Pelicot told reporters she was very emotional and thanked the people who had supported her through the trial.
The trial was a very difficult ordeal, and at this moment I'm thinking of all my 3 children, David, Caroline and Florian. I also think of my grandchildren because they are the future, and it is also for them that I fought this fight. My deepest gratitude is to all the people who supported me. I also think of all the other families that are touched by this tragedy. Finally, I'm thinking of the unrecognized victims whose stories often remain in the shadows. I want you to know that we are sharing the same fight.
We can now speak to our correspondent Ross Cullen in Paris, who's been covering this story for us. Ross, thank you for joining us. This has been one of the most shocking cases and has made headlines around the world, never mind in France. How did the judge's decision go down there today?
Well, hi, Leigh Ann. 3.5 months of harrowing evidence have now come to an end with the verdicts and the sentencing delivered by the judges in the southern city of Avignon on Thursday. And they did find all of the defendants guilty of rape. Now, Gisele Pelicot sentenced to 20 years found guilty of raping his wife, of drugging her, of having recruited men online to come to the family home and to attack Gisele Pelicot while she was unconscious in abuse that lasted 9 years. He was found guilty and sentenced to 20 years, of which he's likely to serve 2/3 of that sentence. And his lawyer says there is still the chance that they might appeal against that sentence. All of the other defendants were found guilty and given custodial terms ranging from 3 to 15 years. But there was outrage among some of the supporters outside a court when they learnt of the sentences, complaining that they were too short, they were too lenient, and Gisele Pelicot's children did say that they were disappointed by those sentences.
Gisele Pelicot spoke outside court today. She's showed huge strength throughout this whole trial. We did hear a short clip before. What else did she have to say, and what was her reaction to the overall sentencing?
Yeah, well, she was resolute, as she has been attending these hearings over the last 3.5 months, and she was there once again in court for the verdicts and the sentencing. After the court proceedings came to an end, she spoke at the courthouse, and she said that by opening the doors to this trial, I wished for society to join in the debates that were held. I never regretted this decision. Now, Leigh Ann, this is because she waived her anonymity. This trial could have been held behind closed doors, but Gisele Pelicot and her legal team took the decision to hold this in public to try to ensure that shame changes sides, is how Gisele Pelicot has put it. So the focus is not on her, not on the victim of the rape, but on those who have been committing the attacks.
This case has prompted calls from activists who believe consent should be included as a factor when it comes to accusations of rape, something we've heard a lot about during this trial. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's right. France's law at the moment, in terms of the legal definition of rape, focuses on a coercion, threat, violence or surprise. Consent is not included in it at the moment, and there have been calls for consent to be incorporated into a new legal definition of rape. In fact, some of the defence that was put forward during the trial of those defendants who were then convicted on Thursday was that they didn't believe it was rape because they either thought Gisele Pelicot was pretending to sleep, or that they believed the consent and approval given by her then husband was sufficient enough for the assaults they were committing on Gisele Pelicot not to be classed as such.
Ross Cullen in Paris, thank you so much for joining us. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines today. Israel says its fighter jets have carried out a series of strikes against military targets in Yemen belonging to Iran-backed Houthis. An Israeli spokesman said the targets included Red Sea ports and energy infrastructure in the capital city. Reports from a Houthi-run TV station say 9 people were killed in the Hudaydah province. This comes hours after a missile fired from Yemen was intercepted over central Israel. French President Emmanuel Macron has arrived in Mayotte as the island continues to reel from the devastation caused by Cyclone Chido. Macron landed in the French Indian Ocean territory this morning and said he brought 4 tons of food and health cargo with him. French officials say at least 31 people have died while thousands are still missing after Saturday's deadly storm. The US Supreme Court has agreed to hear last-ditch legal arguments from TikTok as to why it should not be banned or sold in America. The government is taking action against the social media app because of what it says are its links to the Chinese state, which both TikTok and its parent company ByteDance deny. Earlier this month, the Federal Appeals Court rejected an attempt to overturn the legislation. At least 13 people have died and 2 more are missing after an Indian Navy speedboat ploughed into the side of a passenger ferry off the coast of Mumbai following an engine malfunction. According to officials, 3 Navy personnel are among the dead, while more than 100 people have been rescued. Footage posted online showed the speedboat circling before colliding with the ferry, which later capsized. And the Japanese city, Fukushima, is going to start naming and shaming people who break the rules around household rubbish. Starting in March, officials will go through bags of trash that don't meet regulations, such as those which have not been sorted correctly or which exceed size limits, and in some cases publicly identify their owners. The new regulations are part of Japan's long push to enhance its waste management system. Countries around the world are preparing for the uncertainty of a second Donald Trump presidency, with many central banks adding a note of caution to their 2025 outlook. The incoming US president has promised a range of tariffs and threatened to deport millions of illegal immigrants, which is likely to affect the global economy. Nick Harper has this report from Washington.
It was all smiles at the New York Stock Exchange on Wednesday at the closing bell, but the Dow Jones's 1,100-point drop told a different story. US markets have fallen for the last 10 days, wiping billions off share prices and worrying investors about what comes next. One bit of certainty is a second Donald Trump presidency, but what that looks like is in itself creating uncertainty. He's warned he'll impose tariffs on Canada, Mexico and China, for starters, and his mass deportation plan could see 11 million migrants forced out of the US. That would drastically reduce the workforce, causing GDP, by some estimates, to shrink by more than $1 trillion. For the US Federal Reserve, that's creating a wait-and-see situation.
We just don't know really very much at all about the actual policies, so it's very premature to try to make any kind of conclusion. We don't know what will be tariffed from what countries, for how long, in what size. We don't know whether there'll be retaliatory tariffs. We don't know what the transmission of any of that will be into consumer prices.
On Wednesday, the US Central Bank cut interest rates, but forecast fewer rate reductions next year, pointing to the uncertainty factor of Trump's possible policies. There was a similar message from the Bank of England and the Bank of Japan. Both on Thursday kept interest rates unchanged.
Uncertainty remains in the US and overseas economic outlook. There's also significant uncertainty in the incoming US administration's economic policies.
Norway, Sweden, Canada, Europe, all of their central banks are signalling uncertainty and weakening outlooks for 2025.
I think you're going to start to see more and more folks there that say, you know what, we're in an environment, we need to sit tight, let this play out, and try not to be involved too much in the market.
The economic impacts of Trump's return remain unclear, even as many countries are still struggling with stubborn post-pandemic inflation. It's still another month before Donald Trump returns to the White House, but he's already rattled central bankers, who for now are waiting on policies that could create global turmoil. Nick Harper, Al Arabiya News, Washington.
Let's take a look at the top business news. The Belfast shipyard, Harland & Wolff, responsible for building the Titanic, has been saved from administration by Spanish state-owned shipbuilder Navantia. Around 1,000 jobs will be kept as part of the deal, which also includes Harland & Wolff's other facilities in Scotland and England. Navantia currently employs more than 4,000 people and has an annual turnover of around 1.3 billion euros. El Salvador has agreed a $1.4 billion loan deal with the International Monetary Fund in order to scale back on its Bitcoin policies. The South American country was the first in the world to make Bitcoin legal tender in 2021. The IMF said risks related to the world's largest cryptocurrency, which hit a record high this week, have now eased. Turning to sports now, and Texan-based Friedkin Group, who also own Italian Syriac club Roma, has completed the takeover of Everton today. It's thought the deal is worth around £400 million, making the Merseyside club the 10th team to be under majority American ownership in the Premier League. CEO Dan Friedkin has said he is honoured to become a custodian of the great institution and has been proposed as chairman of Everton's board. And New Zealand's Liam Lawson will race for Red Bull in 2025 as he's promoted to the F1 front line, joining world champion Max Verstappen. It comes as the team parts way with Mexican driver Sergio Perez. Red Bull boss Christian Horner said Lawson is capable of delivering strong results and will come out on top. Christmas markets have long been popular in continental Europe, attracting visitors from far and wide to sample local food and offering a chance to buy some last-minute presents. But in recent years, these festive events have exploded in popularity in the UK. The number of established markets has more than tripled, and sizable annual Christmas markets can be found in most towns and also cities. John Beaver went to one of the biggest in the UK to find out what's behind the rise.
In the middle of this World Heritage Site in southwest England, Bath Christmas Market is now an established part of the city's calendar. Hundreds of vendors are visited by hundreds of thousands of customers.
For us it's vital, really. I would say probably we really couldn't survive really without the market. It's very important for us, definitely.
This tea company enjoyed record sales on the opening weekend. Its owner believes the market is offering something different to consumers.
I think with the rise of big supermarket chains and big brands, people are starting to feel that they want something a little bit more special, a little bit more handmade, from local businesses and locally sourced, so they can actually get something that you can't get anywhere else.
Once a staple of Germany and continental Europe, recent research has found that larger Christmas markets have now become tourist destinations in their own right.
Christmas markets are now big business in the UK, and they've become increasingly popular in recent years. From around 30 in 2007, there are now more than 100, and they can be found in every corner of the country.
The market is organised and run by the local council. They're quick to point out the importance of the events on the wider economy.
When we get it right, the impact's massive, and I think last year we brought in about 47 million into the local economy, and we welcomed about 450,000 people over the course of the sort of nearly 3 weeks that it was running. But it's massive for our local restaurants, pubs, bars, for the local tourism sector, where people can stay in the city and spend more time. So everyone in that sector is really benefiting.
Markets are sometimes criticised for being too expensive and taking business away from some traditional shops. But their popularity is still growing, becoming an established part of the festive calendar. John Beaver, Al Arabiya News, Bath.
Oh, I do love a Christmas market, but let's get you a reminder of those top stories. Vladimir Putin proposes a high-tech duel between Russian and American missiles as he predicts dramatic changes in the war against Ukraine. Meanwhile, North Korea's Kim Jong-un is reportedly training and deploying fresh troops to support Russia on the battlefield. And Dominique Pelicot is jailed for 20 years for drugging and sexually assaulting his wife and inviting others to join in. Gisele Pelicot thanks supporters outside court as the historic mass rape trial comes to an end. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you for joining us. Special interviews with boxing legends Eddie Hearn and Tyson Fury are coming up next. And don't miss Tom Burgess-Watson with GNT. Good night.